Today, I want to start with a question that sounds simple, but the more you sit with it, the weirder it's going to get. And for the purposes of this topic, I'm going to pretend that most of you are Gen X, though I really hope you're not. Do you remember when one scandal could actually matter? No, seriously. I mean, think about that for a second. Remember when one ugly comment, one major lie, one abuse of power, one humiliating public moment, an exposed affair, a tape that leaked, one obviously ethical breach, one shocking misuse of office. Remember when that could define a politician? Remember when it could sink them? Remember when it could end careers, derail campaigns, trigger resignations, dominate the news for weeks, and leave a permanent stain that people talked about for years? Remember when screaming too loud was a thing? Remember when a weird photo was a thing? Do you remember when spelling potato wrong was somehow a huge deal? Remember when wearing a tan suit turned into a national emergency for a kind of cable news viewer? Which, by the way, still remains one of the funniest accidental cell phones in modern media. Because imagine telling future generations, yes, we were very concerned. The suit was beige. We feared for the Republic. But that's the point. Not every old scandal was noble. Not that our politics were ever pure. Lord, no. American politics has never been pure. This country was born arguing, scheming, backstabbing, grandstanding, lying with a straight face. That part is not new. Dirt is not new. Hypocrisy is not new. Shamelessness is not new. What feels new is the volume, the scale, the frequency, and the numbness. Now it feels like a politician can do something that 20 years ago would have detonated their career by lunchtime. And by dinner, we've already moved on to the next outrage. By the next morning, somebody's posting memes. By the end of the week, their supporters are saying, well, I don't like it, but what about the other side? And by the following Monday, half the country is acting like it never happened at all. That's what I want to talk about today. Not just the scandals themselves, not just the hypocrisy, not just the circus that is media now. I want to talk about the line. That invisible line, the one that says, okay, this is too far. The line that says, you cannot do this and still be elected. The line that says, I don't care if you're on my team, this is a deal breaker. Because here's the thing, I don't think the line disappeared. I think thinking of it that way is too comforting. I think it lets us off the hook a little too easily. It's nicer to imagine that some mysterious force came in the night and stole our standards while we slept. That's cleaner. That's easier. That means it happened to us. But I don't think that's what happened. I think we moved it. Slowly, quietly, bit by bit, one rationalization at a time, one the other side is worse at a time, one, well, that's just how politics are at a time. And now here we are, looking around at things that would have once seemed unthinkable and reacting with all the moral urgency of a guy glancing at a weather app. Oh, wow. 70% chance of constitutional decay. Better get a hoodie. That's where we are. So today I want to walk through how that happened. I want to talk about when the line seemed clearer, why it started moving, how constant scandal changes human psychology, how media and social platforms turned outrage into background noise, what happens when a democracy loses its standards, and whether there's any way to move that line back. Because whether you're left, right, center, exhausted, cynical, furious, or just trying to survive without throwing your phone into the river, this topic matters. It matters because democracies do not only die from coups and tanks and dramatic movie villain speeches. Sometimes they die from erosion, from normalization, from lowered expectations, from a culture slowly deciding that nothing is shocking enough to matter anymore. And once that happens, power stops fearing shame. And that's dangerous. So let's talk about the line we keep moving. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left, a podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, your host, and today we're going to be talking about, well, to start off, romance. You know, people love to romanticize the past. I try not to do that. I really do. I'm not interested in that lazy nostalgia where everybody suddenly remembers some magical time when politicians were perceived as honorable and journalists were fearless, citizens were informed, and bald eagles personally delivered fact-checked newspapers to every porch in America. That time did not exist. The past was messy too, corrupt, biased, even cruel sometimes. But, and this is an important but, even in a messy system, there can still be clearer boundaries. There can be shared standards. There can be a cultural sense that some things are beyond the pale. And for a long time, even with all our ugliness, American politics did seem to operate with a somewhat clearer idea of what counted as disqualifying. Imperfectly, inconsistently, and sometimes unfairly, but yes, more clearly. Think back to Watergate. Now, Watergate is one of those things people name drop without always sitting with how seismic it really was. This was not just, oh, politicians did a shady thing. This was a constitutional crisis, a burglary, a cover-up, abuse of federal agencies, an attempt to undermine democratic accountability from inside the presidency itself. And what followed? Investigations, hearings, public outrage, Republican leaders eventually going to Nixon and basically saying to him, it's over. That matters. Not because the system worked perfectly. It certainly didn't. Not because every villain got what they deserved. That didn't happen either. But because enough people in power still understood that the office could not just absorb unlimited misconduct forever. At some point, the scandal became too big to defend. Too obvious to spin, too toxic to survive. There was a line. Now jump forward a bit. Think about Gary Hart, if you remember him, in the late 80s. His presidential hopes crashed around revelations of infidelity. Think about what that tells you about public expectations at the time. Again, not saying media scrutiny was always healthy or proportional. A lot of it was invasive and moralistic and weirdly prurient sometimes. But the broader point still stands. Character scandals could destroy national ambitions. Think about Dan Quayle and Potato. Think about Howard Dean screaming at a rally. Think about the obsession over Al Gore supposedly exaggerating things. Think about John Edwards. Think about Anthony Weiner. Think about the way political coverage used to fixate on gaffes and affairs and embarrassing moments or ethical lapses, as if each one might permanently brand a candidate. Sometimes that was absurd. Yes, of course. Sometimes the line was drawn in ridiculous places. Sometimes we treated trivial weirdness like a moral collapse while ignoring deeper structural abuses. But at least there was still a line that people believed in. Let me say that another way. The old system wasn't always fair, but it was still capable of shame. That is different from the way we live now. Because now it's not just that major scandals happen. It's that they stack, they pile up, they blur together, they compete with each other, and they hit a public that had already been conditioned to expect the next one before they've even finished processing the last one. Back then, a scandal could dominate the landscape because there was enough empty space around it. It had a chance to breathe. The public could sit with it. Journalists could chase after it. Late night comedians could build routines around the event that lasted for months. Voters could absorb it slowly and say, wow, that must really matter. Now, good luck. Now a scandal lands in the middle of a hurricane made of 10 other scandals, 12 conspiracy theories, 3 viral clips, 4 rage bait headlines, a celebrity meltdown, a breaking international crisis, and somebody's cousin posting a fake quote over an AI image of a bald eagle crying over the Constitution. So what happens? The scandal doesn't necessarily get disproven. It doesn't even have to be forgiven at this point. It just gets submerged, buried in the churn. And the churn changes everything. Because here's the thing. Political accountability doesn't only depend on facts. It depends on attention. It depends on memory. It depends on our emotional energy. It depends on a public that can still say, wait, stop, this one matters. If people lose that ability, then standards don't vanish all at once. They decay. And that decay can be hard to see while you're living in the middle of it. Think about the boiling frog metaphors. People always use that one, even though apparently the biology is shaky, but you get the point. If change comes gradually, humans adapt. We normalize. We adjust our expectations downward. We tell ourselves stories to make the new reality feel manageable. That's what I think has happened politically. We have adapted to behavior that once we would have rejected. Not because we really approve of the current behavior, not even because we always stopped caring or something like that, but because the constant repetition has made it feel ordinary. And ordinary is powerful. Once something feels ordinary, you stop reacting to it as a warning sign anyway. You start treating it as weather, I guess is a good analogy, as background, part of the furniture. A lie becomes just politics. Cruelty becomes telling it like it is. Corruption becomes that's just how the game is played. And threats become heated rhetoric. Authoritarian impulses are described as owning the libs. Blatant hypocrisy becomes both sides do it. Stay with me here because this matters. The line did not just move at the elite level. It moved in living rooms and at dinner tables in group chats, definitely on social media. In the private little negotiations people make with themselves when they decide what they're willing to excuse from people they vote for, people they defend, people they identify with. And that brings us to the next part of this. Death by 1,000 scandals. Because if you want to understand why the line has moved, you have to understand scale. One scandal can shock a system. 1,000 scandals can exhaust it. Now, that sounds backwards, but I think it's true. We like to imagine that more evidence of bad behavior should produce more outrage. That if somebody does 10 outrageous things instead of one, then public condemnation should be 10 times stronger. In a rational world, maybe, but in a human world, not necessarily. In a human world, repeated exposure can have the opposite effect. The first outrage gets your attention. The fifth thing gets your concern. The 10th just makes your eyes roll. The 50th thing gets, what else is new? And by the 100th thing, a lot of people are just trying to protect their own nervous systems. Because outrage takes energy. Moral clarity takes energy. Paying attention takes energy. Holding contradictory facts in your head requires energy. And when every day feels like an assault of fresh insanity, people start rationing that energy. They have to. They have jobs and kids and bills and back pains and depression and grocery prices and aging parents and, real life. So a lot of people do what humans always do when they're overwhelmed. They simplify. They retreat to tribe. They stop asking, is this acceptable? And start asking, whose side are you on? That is one of the most destructive shifts in modern politics. Once tribal identity becomes the main filter, the line stops being universal. It becomes conditional. If my side does it, well, there must be context. If your side does it, it proves moral collapse. If my politician lies, it's strategy. If your politician lies, it's corruption. If my side breaks norms, it's necessary toughness. If your side breaks norms, it's authoritarianism. Now, to be fair, everybody is vulnerable to this. Everybody. Liberals, conservatives, independents who brag that they hate both parties equally as if that itself is a personality. Human beings are tribal creatures. We all protect our side more than we want to admit. But in the current era, that instinct has been supercharged, industrialized, monetized, turned into a business model. And that's why one of the most important shifts in political culture is this. Scandal is no longer merely about what happened. It's about whether your audience has been trained to care. Now think about that. Not whether it's true, not whether it's serious, whether your audience has been trained to care. That means if a scandal breaks, the first question is not, did this happen? The first question is, which media ecosystem do you live in? Because if you live in one ecosystem, this is the end of democracy. If you live in another, the same story is fake news. And if you live in a third, maybe it's just old news. And there's even a fourth where it's somehow always Hillary's fault, which, honestly, that woman has been blamed for so much at this point, she could probably be blamed when my Wi-Fi goes down. But that's how absurd it gets. And the repetition matters because it creates a feeling of futility. People start thinking, why even react? Nothing changes. That might be the most dangerous sentence in modern civic life. Why react? Nothing changes. Because once citizens internalize that, misconduct suddenly is now cheap. Political costs drop. Shame stops functioning as a deterrent for anything. Leaders learn they can survive almost anything as long as they never apologize, never step back, never concede the frame, and keep the base emotionally activated. Once leaders learn that lesson, they use it. Of course they do. If you teach ambitious people that there is no downside to shamelessness, you are going to get more shameless people. It's not complicated. It's grim, but it's not complicated. Let me say that another way. If the only surviving politicians are the ones willing to bulldoze every norm, then over time, politics gets populated by expert bulldozers. That's not accidental. That's selection pressure. The system starts rewarding the exact traits that used to be considered disqualifying. Lying without hesitation, denying obvious reality, attacking anyone who questions you, turning every accusation into proof that you are being persecuted, reframing accountability as victimhood, treating legal scrutiny, ethical scrutiny, scrutiny from the press as interchangeable enemies of the people. Once that playbook works, everyone copies it. And then what was once shocking becomes a strategy. Which brings us to the psychology of normalization, because this part is bigger than politics. This is human nature. As humans, we can get used to almost anything. That is one of our greatest strengths, but also one of our darkest vulnerabilities. We can adapt to change. We can endure pain. We can rebuild after loss. We can survive horrors. That resilience is beautiful, but it also means that we can get used to dysfunction. We can acclimate to cruelty. We can normalize instability. We can make a home inside conditions that should alarm us. You see it in relationships. A person doesn't usually wake up one morning in a full-blown toxic dynamic and say, perfect, this seems healthy. Usually it happens gradually. First, it's one cruel joke, then one lie, then one explosion, then one apology, then one excuse, then one new boundary crossed, then another and another. And by the time the whole thing is obviously rotten, the person inside it has adjusted so many times they can barely remember what normal felt like. Politics can work like that too. At first, a lie shocks you. Then another lie annoys you. Then a flood of lies confuses you. Then eventually, the sheer volume makes you shrug and say, well, politicians lie. But hold on. That shrug matters. Because in that shrug, a major distinction disappears. The difference between ordinary political spin and relentless pathological deception gets flattened into one lazy category. Well, they all do it. I can't tell you how many times I hear that from people. And that flattening is deadly. Because yes, all politicians lie. They all shade the truth. All parties spin. Yes, public life has always involved messaging, but there is still a meaningful difference between spin and systematic unreality, between ordinary ambition and contempt for the truth itself, between bending facts and trying to dissolve the public's confidence that facts even exist. When those differences blur, the public loses its footing. And some people want that. That is a goal for some people. Because if some people no longer believe that truth can be known, then accountability becomes virtually impossible. Everything becomes vibes and feelings. Everything becomes team loyalty. Everything just becomes a Rorschach test. And that's not an accident, it's a tactic. But the psychology goes deeper. There's something called habituation. The more you're exposed to a stimulus, the less intensely you tend to respond to it over time. That applies to noise, stress, imagery, even emotional reactions. The first time your upstairs neighbor starts blasting music at 2 a.m., you're furious. By the 10th time, you're still angry, but there's sort of a deadness to it. Part of you has adapted because you literally cannot stay at full alarm forever. Politics now function like the downstairs apartment of democracy where somebody is constantly dragging furniture at 3 a.m. and setting off firecrackers in the bathtub. Eventually, your nervous system just says, I cannot live like this unless I stop reacting to every sound. That is outrage fatigue. It doesn't mean the outrages are suddenly okay. It means that your body and mind found a way to keep functioning in an environment of constant alarm. And here's where I think it gets interesting. Outrage fatigue does not usually produce wisdom. It usually produces cynicism. That's much different. Wisdom says, I will choose my battles carefully, but I still believe standards matter. Cynicism says, nothing matters. Everyone is corrupt. This is all a joke. Those are not the same thing. And cynical people are much easier to rule than engaged people. They are easier to manipulate, easier to demobilize, much easier to distract. If citizens believe the whole system is irredeemably rotten, then the most shameless actors actually gain an advantage. Because now they don't even have to pretend to be decent. They just have to look stronger, louder, more entertaining, or, more vicious than the alternatives. That's how democracies start mistaking spectacle for leadership. And I think we've done a lot of that. Think about how many people now describe politics as if it were a reality show, sport, or fandom. Who won? Who dunked on whom? Who looked weak? Who looked strong? That language is not trivial. It reflects a deeper drift away from actual citizenship and towards spectatorship. A citizen says, what kind of governing norms are being established? A spectator says, was that a good clapback? A citizen asks, is this an abuse of power? A spectator asks, well, did he own them? A citizen might ask, what precedent does this set? A spectator asks, was it funny though? And look, if you know me, I love a good joke. I think humor is vital. Sometimes it's the only way to survive this nonsense with your soul intact. But humor can't replace standards. Irony can't replace accountability. Memes are not a substitute for civic judgment. If anything, memes can sometimes anesthetize us. They let us metabolize something horrifying by turning it into a joke before we've fully confronted what it actually means. And I do it too. We all do it. I'm not pretending I'm above it, but it is worth noticing. Because once politics becomes pure content, even moral collapse becomes just another piece of content. And content moves fast. Which brings us naturally to media and algorithms, because if you want to understand why outrage feels both omnipresent and yet strangely weightless, you have to understand the machine that is delivering it. The modern media environment is built for speed, not depth, for emotional reaction, but not reflection, for volume, not proportion. Traditional media had plenty of flaws. Gatekeeping, establishment bias, timid centrism, sensationalism, all of those things. But the old system did create a kind of bottleneck. Fewer outlets, slower news cycles, more shared attention. When something big happened, more people at least had to live in the same reality for a little while. Now, reality is totally fragmented. Your feed is different from my feed. Your clips are different from my clips. Your obvious truth may be completely invisible to somebody else, or reframed by recognition by the time it actually reaches them. And algorithms love emotion, especially anger, especially fear, disgust. These are sticky emotions. They keep you engaged. They keep you scrolling, and they keep you sharing. They keep you coming back for the next hit. That means the system is constantly incentivized to present everything as urgent, everything as outrageous, everything as existential. You would think that would produce more accountability. But again, humans aren't machines. When everything is framed as the end of the world, eventually people stop distinguishing between levels of severity. A constitutional crisis, a dumb quote, a policy outrage, a celebrity tweet, fake viral humor, they all get jammed into the same emotional blender. You're just supposed to freak out continuously. Nobody can do that forever. So eventually the public adapts by just flattening everything. The truly outrageous stuff loses its edge because it arrives wrapped in the same package as every other disposable outrage. This is one of the great tragedies of the algorithm age. Real alarms get swallowed by false alarms, and trivial alarms until people lose trust in the act of alarming itself. In other words, the house might actually be on fire, but the smoke detector has been screaming for 8 years about burnt toast and steam and whatever else, the fish in the microwave. So when the flames finally hit the curtains, half the house just rolls over and pulls the pillow over its head. That's where I think we are. And to make it worse, politicians and media figures have learned to exploit this chaos intentionally. Flood the zone, move fast, say 10 outrageous things so nobody can focus on any one of them. Generate constant controversy because controversy itself becomes the cover. If critics are always reacting, then critics are always behind. If the public is always overwhelmed, the public is easier to numb. Stay with me here. Outrage used to be a response to scandal. Now outrage is just part of the environment. That changes its meaning. If outrage is ambient, then being outrageous no longer isolates you. It can actually strengthen you by making you the center of attention, the focal point, the main character in a media ecosystem that rewards attention above everything else. That is a monstrous incentive structure. Because if attention is the prize, then scandal becomes a fuel source. Now, I want to be careful here. Not every controversy is manufactured. Not every journalist is just chasing clicks. Not every citizen is some drooling algorithm puppet. People still do real reporting, real organizing, real analysis, real civic work. And thank God for that. But the broad ecosystem is warped. It is warped toward heat rather than light. And when politics becomes a business of that continuous heat, the public can get burned out. And that burnout has consequences because the absence of a clear line does not merely make politics uglier. It changes what power can get away with. When leaders stop fearing consequences, they test new limits. That is true of any institution, a workplace, a school, a church, a corporation, a family. If somebody with authority learns that they can violate norms without losing support, they will very often go further the next time. Why wouldn't they? There is no invisible moral referee descending from the sky to stop them. Institutions only hold if people inside and outside them defend the norms that make them work. And when those norms get weak, you get escalation. The lie gets bigger, the cruelty gets meaner, the abuse gets bolder, the rhetoric gets darker, the loyalty test gets stricter. The contempt for accountability gets more explicit. And then one day, the public looks up and says, how did we get here? We got here because every previous line crossing that was excused became a down payment on the next one. That's how. The road to unthinkable is paved with, well, maybe just this once. Does that make sense? This is what scares me most about losing that line. It's not just the individual outrages, it's the precedent, it's the training effect. It's what both leaders and followers learn from the system. Leaders learn that shamelessness works. Followers learn that defending the indefensible is a loyalty test. Institutions learn that confrontation is costly. Media learns that spectacle pays. Opponents learn that constant emergency is unsustainable. And the broader public learns that expecting integrity will only break your heart. That is a terrible civic education. Because democracy actually depends on expectations, not just laws, expectations. Shared assumptions about what leaders should not do, what voters should not tolerate, what parties should not reward, and what institutions should never excuse. When those expectations collapse, rules are not enough. People always talk as if democracy is just a set of procedures, elections and courts and statutes, the Constitution. Of course, those matter enormously, but the spirit underneath them matters too. A free society depends on habits of restraint, on a culture where not every possible abuse is automatically pursued just because it can be. Once politics becomes purely transactional and norm-free, the question then is no longer, is this appropriate? Now the question is, can we get away with it? And that is where things get dangerous really fast. Because can we get away with it has no built-in moral floor. Now, does that mean all is lost? No, I'm not the harbinger of the apocalypse today. We've got enough of that going around. But what I do think it means is that we need to be honest about what restoring standards would actually require. Because people love to say, we need civility back, or we need decency back, or we have to return to norms. Okay, fine. Nice sentiment, but what does that actually mean? It means citizens have to stop outsourcing moral judgment to their tribe. That's the hard part. It means being willing to say, I agree with this person on taxes or immigration or judges or foreign policy or whatever, but this particular behavior is still unacceptable. It means refusing to treat every accountability question as a partisan attack. It means demanding more from your own side than from the people you already despise, which, by the way, is the exact opposite of what most people do. It means rebuilding a culture where Shame is not seen as weakness, and apologizing is not automatically treated like political suicide. It means journalists need proportion. Citizens need attention spans. Institutions need spines. Parties need standards. And voters need memory. Yes, memory. Because part of the reason the line keeps moving is that public memory keeps shrinking. Everything becomes eternal present tense. Every scandal is just now. Every lie is now. Every norm violation is now. And when it fades from the feed, it fades from the civic consciousness. But democracy has to have memory. It needs citizens who can say, no, wait, this is part of a pattern. It needs people who can connect dots across months and years rather than responding only to today's emotional spike. Patterns matter more than moments. That's another way the line gets lost. We judge each event in isolation. Well, maybe this one isn't so bad. Maybe that quote was taken out of context. Maybe this move is technically illegal. Maybe that outburst was just frustration. And individually, each rationalization can seem plausible, at least plausible enough to people who already are inclined to excuse it. But step back and look at the pattern. That's where clarity lives. Pattern reveals character. Pattern reveals intent. Pattern reveals whether somebody occasionally crosses the line or is actively erasing the line altogether. So, can the line come back? I think it can. But not because some heroic institution is going to swoop in and save us. Not because one election is ever going to fix everything. Not because one scandal will finally wake everybody up. We tell ourselves that too. Surely this will be the thing. Maybe, sometimes, but usually not. Usually there's no single magic event. Usually change comes from accumulation in the other direction. From enough people gradually deciding that they're done excusing what they used to excuse. That's slower. That's much less cinematic, much more human. It starts in conversations, in media choices, in what people reward, in what people defend, in the standards community set, in whether parties believe voters will punish or excuse shamelessness. And yes, it starts with us asking ourselves uncomfortable questions. Where is my line? Not abstractly, not performatively, really. What would actually make me withdraw support from my guy or my gal? What behavior do I keep minimizing because it's politically convenient? At what point have I told myself so many yeah but stories that I no longer recognize my own standard? That's not just a question for the right. That's a question for everybody. Because the temptation to move the line is universal. Power makes excuses of us all if we are not careful. And here's my opinion-driven beat for the day. I think one of the ugliest things that has happened in modern political culture is the way consistency itself is treated like foolishness. As if having principles that apply across teams somehow makes you naive. As if refusing to bend your standards every time your tribe demands it means you don't get how politics works. No, I reject that. Principles are not naivete. Standards are not weakness. Integrity does not equal political illiteracy. In fact, the people constantly telling you that you must excuse everything because that's just the game are often the very people most invested in making sure the game stays filthy. Don't let them flatter you out of your conscience. Because once conscience becomes optional, citizenship becomes empty. Now, that sounds lofty, but it's real. A republic cannot survive simply on procedure alone. It needs a public with enough moral muscle to feel revulsion when power becomes shameless, and enough stamina to hold on to that revulsion longer than one news cycle. That's the challenge right there. Not to be permanently outraged. Nobody can live that way. Not to treat every headline like an apocalypse. That just fries your brain. But to try and recover proportion. To know the difference between dumb and dangerous. Between embarrassing and disqualifying. Between noise and a real warning siren. We have to learn that. We have to rebuild the capability to say calmly and clearly, no, that is too far. Not because we're pearl-clutching Puritans, not because politics is somehow meant to be pristine, not because human beings will stop disappointing us, but because power without boundaries is a threat. Always. Left, right, center, doesn't matter. If you create a culture where winning excuses everything, then eventually anything shows up. And by then it's too late to pretend you never approved the method. You did approve it. Maybe not enthusiastically, maybe even reluctantly, but every excuse feeds the machine. That's the bitter truth. So maybe restoring the line begins with smaller acts than people think. Maybe it begins when citizens stop treating politics like fandom. Maybe it begins when more people say, I do not care that he's funny. I do not care that she's on my side. I do not care that the other team is awful. This particular thing is still wrong. Maybe it begins when the words both sides stop being a sedative that people use to avoid distinguishing degrees and patterns of consequence. Because not all misconduct is equal. Not all lies are equal. Not all norm violations are equal. Refusing false equivalence is part of having standards too. That matters. And it means moving beyond lazy cynicism. Cynicism feels smart. It really does. It feels worldly and hardened, too savvy to be fooled. But cynicism is often just exhausted surrender in fancy sunglasses. Hope, on the other hand, gets mocked. Standards get mocked. Decency gets mocked. People act like expecting better is childish. And I don't buy that. I think the most childish thing in the world is pretending there are no consequences for the standards we abandon. There are consequences. There's always consequences. They show up slowly, then all at once. They show up in the kind of candidates parties promote. They show up in the kind of rhetoric citizens absorb. They show up in whether lies are punished or rewarded. They show up in whether public servants fear ethics or laugh at them. They show up in the public's shrinking ability to be shocked by things that should absolutely shock them. That's how you know the line is moved. Not just because leaders behave badly, but because the public stops registering the behavior as exceptional. And once that happens, the next line crossing is so much easier. And the next one is easier still, and on and on and on. So as I wrap this up, I want to bring it back to the question we started with. Do you remember when one scandal could matter? Maybe the better question is, why doesn't it now? And maybe the answer is not simply that politicians got worse, or the media got louder, or platforms got more toxic. No, I mean, all of that is true in part, but maybe the deeper answer is that a culture can only defend lines it still believes are real. And somewhere along the way, too many people decided that the line was negotiable, movable, conditional, tribal, a prop, something to invoke when the other side sins and ignore when your side does. That's how unthinkable things become normal. Not all at once, not with a trumpet blast, not with one dramatic turning point everybody notices in real time, but in increments, in shrugs, in memes, in excuses, in strategic silences, in selective outrage, in public amnesia, in the endless little bargains people make with themselves when they decide that preserving power is more important than preserving standards. We did not wake up one day in a country with no line. That didn't happen. We got here by moving it. Slowly, quietly, one excuse at a time. And the scariest part is not that the line moved. It's how many people adjusted so completely that they no longer remember where that line used to be. That's the part that should keep us awake at night. Because if we cannot remember the line, how are we going to defend it? And if we can't defend it, then the people seeking power will keep testing how far they can go until too far means nothing at all. So maybe that is the work now. Not to live in permanent panic, not to perform outrage like it's a job, not to mistake every stupid controversy for a constitutional crisis, but to rebuild our moral eyesight, to recover the ability to tell the difference between ordinary politics and real danger. To remember that standards only survive when we enforce them. To decide privately and publicly where our line is. And then, when it matters, to hold that line. All right. Thank you so much for downloading and listening to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. I want to hear back from you. I want to hear your thoughts on this episode. I want to hear where you think the line should be. And do you think I'm right on where it went? Or is there a different idea in your head? Anything, compliments, critiques, suggestions, questions, whatever. Reach out. Go to the podcast website, www.neighborontheleft.com. Go to the contacts page. Use one of the social media platforms and instant message me. Use the email address and send an email to the podcast. You can also go to the web player section and you can listen to or download any of the episodes of the podcast since the very beginning. And you can also go to the blog portion of the website and read the blog post that goes along with this particular episode, which is a somewhat summarized version of everything I just ranted about, but it also has the sources that I used. Whenever I do blog posts, they always have the sources. I'll be back on Wednesday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.